a small step for a man, a giant leap for people, in essence about the beginnings of the Coptic alphabet. So what we are going to do is we're going to look at the change in the writing systems used to denote the Egyptian language in about the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, that's the later Roman period in Egypt. We're going to look at how, by means of using the Greek and the then receding Egyptian writing systems as models and sources, people managed to end up with a writing system that suits the needs of the evolved Egyptian language. Now, in the past, the historical and sociolinguistic perspectives on this issue have been explored in detail by Bagenal, who focuses on the priestly environment, and by Fournet, who focuses more on the literature, on the genres of literature and epistolography. Both of them think about the social sphere which the new script, the Coptic alphabet, emerged from. We also have a detailed inventory of gradual changes in scribal habits. By Quack, he traces the gradual change from the early Egyptian script over several experimental writing systems to the Coptic alphabet and posits the beginnings of a fully functional Coptic alphabet around 100 AD. Today, I want to add the cognitive or psycholinguistic perspective to the picture by looking at the systemic change from the inherited Egyptian scripts to alphabetic Coptic. I will test the hypotheses of natural evolution due to cognitive primes and of artificial creation resulting from socio-political pressures. And I will show that these two actually complement each other. Socio-political factors pertain to the early promotion of the new writing system, and cognitive linguistic factors underlie the systemic change. On the slide, you have an overview of my talk. I'm briefly going to talk about the difference between language and script which is essential to this paper. Then I'm going to introduce you to the writing systems in Egypt and to the situational contexts in Egypt. Then we are going to look at our two hypotheses at the perspective of sociolinguistics and the hypothesis of creation, and at the perspective of psycholinguistics and the hypothesis of evolution. And finally, I will bring everything together in a short summary and conclusion. So let's get started. We are first of all looking at language versus script. So from the perspective of functional grammar, we define a language as the combination of a conceptual, a grammatical, an output, and a contextual component. So basically, we have an idea that is framed in a certain structure, and then there's the sound level put on top of that, and then the situational context impacts on how we phrase things. A language presents a continuity over time, even if labeling obscures this in some cases. Think, for example, of the transition from Latin to early French. That is one of those transitions where it is very difficult even to apply labels, and where we basically have language continuity, but at some point we apply different labels to what is in essence the same language. By contrast, a script is an initially artificially created selective graphic representation of the acoustic signal. What do I mean by that? Basically, a graphic representation of the acoustic signal has to be selective because the acoustic signal is too complex to represent everything. A writing system thus balances the issues of economy and practicability, that is, assign inventory that is usable rather than ideal. The gaps in this system of representation are filled by conventions, which users of writing systems are familiar with. Scripts in languages, and that is important, do not enter into any kind of one-to-one correspondence. Two good examples are the Latin alphabet, which is used for a large number of languages, for very different languages, and, for example, the Chinese language, which has its own writing system, but can also be written or transcribed in the Latin alphabet. Let's move on to types of writing systems. In essence, we distinguish between three types: syllabic or morphosyllabic, and morphosyllabic or moraic writing systems, which map a phonological unit, that is a syllable or a mora, on a grapheme. Good examples are the Japanese hiragana syllabary or the ancient Mycenaean syllabary. Then we have alphasyllabic writing systems. There the signs represent consonants, which are supplemented by diacritics representing the vowels. Examples are, for example, modern Thai or also the Devanagari script. And finally, last but not least, we obviously have abjads and alphabetic writing systems, and these map a phonetic unit, that is a phoneme, on a grapheme. In an abjad, the graphemes represent consonants and semivowels, think of Hebrew or Arabic, and in an alphabet, the graphemes represent consonants, semivowels, and vowels, as in Latin and Greek. Now, what happens in Egyptian over time? For most of its history, actually, Egyptian could be written with more than one writing system. We have basically a three-script system, and the three scripts are cursive, primarily used for everyday writing, a script used primarily in religious texts, and a script primarily used in monumental inscriptions, and we will see that is the hieroglyphic script all the way through. Examples of several Egyptian scripts used alongside each other include, for example, the Rosetta Stone, where we have demotic, the cursive, and then hieroglyphic. As a result of this situation, of this multi-script situation, diachronic stages of Egyptian are traditionally referred to by the name of the writing system used in everyday, non-specific contexts. Hence, we speak of demotic in the Ptolemaic period and early Roman period, and of Coptic later on. That's the same language, just different labels based on the everyday writing system. The native Egyptian writing systems shared a mapping principle between sound and grapheme, and this mapping principle combined mapping phonological units and mapping phonemes on graphemes. It was basically a mixed system. This is very, very different from alphabetic writing systems. So why this fundamental change in the later Roman period, this change towards the Coptic alphabet? So let's have a look at writing systems in Egypt. As mentioned, the native Egyptian scripts combine are basically mixed systems. They combine consonantal, biconsonantal, and triconsonantal phonograms with ideogrammatic logograms and determinatives. Some signs, and I should mention that, can either be phonograms or logograms, and that is a phonogram indicating a sound or logogram indicating a meaning. Determinatives are added to a phonologically represented word in order to disambiguate the meaning. My example is the string NB, nep, which could mean basket or lord, and then based on the determinative, based on whether you take it as a logogram or whether you have the determinative with the man with the hands lifted up, it means basket or lord. Vowels in these systems are not consistently written, although some vowels could be indicated, for example, R, I, U. Now, where these native Egyptian scripts over time differ is in the level of abstraction of the signs, and I've taken two extremes. So you have the aleph bird on the slide, which is clearly identifiable as a bird in classical hieroglyphs. In demotic, things look quite different. In the later Roman period, we witness regional diversification of this everyday Egyptian writing system of demotic and the proliferation and subsequent abandonment of hieroglyphs. Now let's turn to the second type of writing system that we have in Egypt. These are alphabets, which map a phoneme onto a graphic unit. They existed in Egypt from early on. I have two simple examples for you. The Aramaic abjad was used by the Jewish community on the island of Elephantine, and the Syriac abjad is attested in letters from the Manichaean village community of Calais in the later Roman period. Then we also, in addition to these abjads, we have the Greek and Latin alphabets, obviously, which took hold in Egypt primarily in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and they notate vowels, semivowels, and consonants. Now, the Latin alphabet always, all the way through its history, remained functionally very limited to specific spheres, either the army or, as Adams calls it, a super high variety. The Greek alphabet, on the other hand, really gained an importance in the Ptolemaic period, and that might now explain why the Koine Greek alphabet that was in use in this kind of Ptolemaic period, this repertoire of graphemes and pairings between grapheme and phonetic values serves as the model for Coptic, rather than Greek local alphabets, which were in use much earlier, which were in use when Greek was first imported to Egypt, but apparently that was completely confined to very small local communities. Now let's have a look at Coptic. The Coptic alphabet consists of all 24 letters of the Greek alphabet, along with the in writing obsolescent digamma. Yet, the Greek and Egyptian phonemic repertoires differ such that several letters were not needed to write Egyptian words. For example, there's no distinction between voiced and voiceless dentals and gutturals, thus gamma and delta were imported primarily to write Greek loanwords. Also, several Egyptian sounds could not be represented by the Greek letters, thus demotic-derived graphemes were added, and you have those on the slide, so sh, f, ch, k, and t. I can't fully well pronounce those sounds, I think. The number and the exact shape and the phonetic value of these extra graphemes remained fluctuating, primarily due to regional variation. Regarding the number, for example, we have a sign representing a velar fricative in Achememic and Bohairic, but not in Sahidic. Regarding the shape, that is due to the fact that we have graphic alternatives already in demotic, and we have phonological changes that make certain signs redundant. Thus, when you kind of look for a model for your Coptic grapheme, you have quite a choice, and local communities made different choices. Regarding phonetic value, a good example is beta, which is a voiced labial plosive in Sahidic in line with Classical Greek, but a voiced labial fricative in Bohairic and Achaemenic in line with Koine Greek. This variability between local varieties or dialects, or also local writing traditions, decreased in the 5th century, with Sahidic becoming the standard literary dialect. So much about the writing systems. Let's move on to the situational context, and we are going to split that into the sociopolitical, sociolinguistic, and sociocultural contexts. Let's start with the socio-political situation. Politically, we see laxer government control. For example, the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 allowed or made everyone a Roman citizen, and thus allowed that Roman citizens' wills were no longer have to be written in Latin, but could be written in a language other than Latin. Societally, we see fluidity between formally distinct groups, between Greeks and Egyptians, for example, in the naming practices. Economically, we witness recess, for example, in the receding building activity, not only in smaller cities and villages, but also then later on in cities like Alexandria. So by and large, we really see a region at the crossroads. The central government was losing power, and local public and clerical institutions were gaining power. Furthermore, smaller local groups could now establish much more close-knit social networks than before, because they had more freedom to actually organize themselves. A good example is the Manichaean community in Callis in the later Roman period. Let's move on to the sociolinguistic context. Now, in order for a language to stand its ground in a bilingual setting, it needs a writing system, educational backing, and political backing. Now, what's the situation like in Egypt? An alphabetic writing system, or rather systems, for the Egyptian language seems to have been fully functional around 100 AD, according to Quack's analysis. This is completely contrary to Bacchanal's claim that there was no Egyptian writing system for about 150 years between the mid-2nd and the 4th centuries. However, the Greek alphabet was an established and fully developed system by this time, by the later Roman period, whereas the Coptic alphabet was still in its infancy. To move on to the educational backing, the temples had been the educational centers for Egyptian, yet financial support from the government really ran out in the later Roman period. This situation did affect Greek educational institutions as well, but monasteries took over here. Last but not least, political backing means that the language is acceptable in official context up to the highest level. The Egyptian everyday language and script, demotic, in the later Roman period, were seemingly denied this status already in the early Roman period, actually. For example, on the stele of Cornelius Gallus, we find inscriptions in Greek, Latin, and hieroglyphs, but not in demotic. The Greek summaries of demotic contracts, of legal documents that became obligatory, seem to confirm this hypothesis. So in essence, what we have here is an imbalance between the status of Greek and the status of Egyptian, and also between the status of the Greek alphabet and the Egyptian script. Now let's turn to the sociocultural context. We see two significant changes in the later Roman period, one regarding cultural mixture and one regarding the religious sphere. Now, in the later Roman period, we seem to have really a Greco-Egyptian or Egypto-Greek culture in everyday life. This is reflected, for example, in the large number of loanwords describing aspects of everyday life. There are really both Greek loanwords in Egyptian and Egyptian loanwords in Greek. You have two simple examples on the slide. For example, bais, Greek bais from Egyptian bai, as a branch of a palm tree, and a Greek psyche, Coptic psyche, psychoa, even with a nice plural in Coptic, is a loanword based on Greek psyche, soul or spirit. With this nice word spirit, turning to the changes in the religious sphere, so the Edict of Milan in 313 granted legal status to Christianity, and in 380 the Edict of Thessalonica made Christianity the official religion. In the aftermath, Christian institutions and Christian thought became more and more prevalent really in all spheres of life, including art, literature, education, and administration. From this situational prologue to our actual hypothesis, so let's first look at the perspective of sociolinguistics and the hypothesis of creation, and then we are going to turn to our second hypothesis. A sociolinguistic approach, in essence, means considering the interaction between a language variety and its social surroundings. Relevant factors include, for example, the political and societal setting, the socioeconomic, educational and societal background of speakers, and the domain of life in which a language is societally licensed. This approach can and has been conferred to writing systems, and we are going to test or look at 3 hypotheses that have been advanced. Number 1 relates to domains of usage and the functionality of a writing system. So the types of texts which contain the earliest attempts of using the Greek alphabet to write Egyptian can help us identify the likeliest context in which the Coptic alphabet originated. The writers of these texts apparently saw a need to go beyond their traditional resources. Why? Well, one hypothesis is that the inherited writing system was no longer fit for the current stage of the language. One context that has been discussed in this with regard to functionality is the magical papyri, because we have those magical spells, so pronunciation is essential, and correct pronunciation even more, because you want to have a specific result. Now here we find contradictory opinions based on the same material. Dieleman claims that Greek letters were used to gloss demotic to ensure correct pronunciation because the demotic writing system was no longer unambiguous. Stadler argues that an intense contact situation resulted in this use of glosses. Now, more recent work, luckily, has shown that 1, the magical papyri were not the first context where we find Greek letters to gloss demotic, and 2, that they show a system of alphabetic demotic and Greek writing only, without any of our additional demotic-derived letters. So the magical papyri do not seem to be this ultimate context to kind of make a decision about the hypothesis of functionality. Another angle to consider may be that Greek loanwords were actually really in common use by the later Roman period. The demotic script, however, does not notate vowels consistently and assigns determinatives to words. So when importing a Greek word, and our poor scribe was faced with 2 challenges. A, he had to get rid of all the vowels, and B, he had to make sure, while doing this, that the representation of the word is still unambiguous, and then you had to assign an appropriate determinative. In a bilingual environment, in such a thoroughly bilingual environment, that seems like a disadvantage. There are very, very few Greek loanwords in demotic. I think 119 is Clarissa's last count. I've put one on the slide, the generic determinative that was assigned to this one is just the book roll. So the second hypothesis that has been advanced in this kind of from sociolinguistic perspective, relates to social networks and communities of practice. A social network is basically the number of people someone gets in touch with, and the people these people get in touch with, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Social networks map the connections between users of a language and also a writing system. Now, from a slightly different angle, social networks can be viewed as communities of practice, in that knowledge or experience can be shared when people interact. Schools are, for example, a really good example of communities of practice. Clarissa's observation regarding Greek scribes preferring pens made of reeds and Egyptian scribes preferring pens made of rushes in the Ptolemaic period shows this quite nicely. So there are 2 traditions of writing, and this kind of tradition is passed down from teacher to student. In the context of these communities of practice and social networks, the hypothesis has been advanced that the Coptic alphabet emerged as an in-group writing system. So in essence, it's a way to distinguish and distance oneself from the outside world. Candidates for in-groups include obviously the early Christians and non-mainstream religious communities such as the Manichaeans. However, the creators of the Coptic alphabet, and we shouldn't forget that, could draw on the Greek and Egyptian writing systems, thus only a highly bilingual or at least biscriptal in-group could be posited. And on top of that, we observe extensive local variation in the earliest stages of the Coptic alphabet, and to a limited extent also later. Hence, we could only hypothesize a range of communities of practice being at the heart of the origins of the Coptic alphabet, but not really one in-group. Let's have a look at hypothesis number 3 related to linguistic identity and political fragmentation. So very generally speaking, the choice of one language or the other shows someone's loyalty to the culture and discourse associated with this language. In this respect, language choice is really emblematic. The relationship between language and identity is, however, reciprocal. So someone's choice of language reflects their choice of identity in any given situation. At the same time, their choice of language is conditioned by the social surroundings. That is again what gʁafematik mentions with regard to the stele of Cornelius Gallus, where we find hieroglyphs, Greek and Latin, but not demotic. And gʁafematik concludes from this, well, that kind of identity-wise, the Egyptian everyday culture was really kicked out, sort of. A hypothesis emerging from these observations is then also the rise of local languages and writing systems as an indication of strengthened local identities in rebellion against the formerly superimposed imperial identity at the point when the kind of imperial power is getting less. However, opinions on this one widely differ. What we can say is that there is really a gradual upward trend of the Egyptian language up to the 6th century, when it even advances into official spheres like the legal sphere. Most likely this trend must have started much earlier than we can observe it, maybe even around the kind of 2nd, 3rd centuries, which would kind of temporally coincide nicely with the Institutio Antoniniana in 212, and would be also temporally quite close to what Quack posits as the date when a Coptic alphabet was at least fully functional, if not standardized, but fully functional. Thus, we do have a temporal link, but not necessarily a causal one. So basically, there may be functionality issues regarding the inherited Egyptian script, demotic. There may be several in-groups who developed writing systems, and there may be identity-related issues involved. Yet none of this explains the systemic change to an alphabetic writing system modeled on the one of the conquerors or the imperial power. So the above observations can only explain why the Greek alphabet served as a model, in essence due to availability and prominence. In order to explain now further kind of why this systemic change, we are going to turn to the psycholinguistic perspective and the hypothesis of evolution. Now here we are going to look at the grain size theory. Basically we know that every language has a perfect fit in relation to the perfect writing system. This results then from the interaction of a language's phonological structure and the grain size of the writing system. Now, what's the grain size? The grain size is the size of the unit that is mapped onto a grapheme. In alphabetic scripts, that is a phoneme. In syllabic scripts, a syllable. The grain size is determined by the interaction of functional pressures, that is pressures towards smaller, orthographically less complex units, what we call granularity, linguistic pressures, that is pressures towards larger, phonologically more accessible units, what we call availability, and statistical pressures, that is pressures towards units that are maximally consistent, that is what we call consistency. And as users of a writing system, we basically get used to the grain size of the writing system we use most commonly. When we switch writing systems, the grain size might pose a bit of an obstacle to us because we have to get used to a new grain size. Now, phonology is, as I say, relevant to the fit of a writing system to a language and to the cognitive process of decoding graphemes when reading. The phonology of languages differs fundamentally, and thus their fit to a writing system does as well. Think about the syllable structure, for example. Now, thinking back about those linguistic pressures I mentioned, our availability issue with the grain size, the universal phonological principle holds that phonological aspects are activated before lexical aspects when reading. Thus, the units of the mapping between function and form, that is, between language and grapheme, are likely to have a phonological or phonetic element to them. Let's apply all of this to Egyptian, with the caveat that we suddenly see vowels written. That's a big caveat. Suddenly in Coptic we see vowels, unlike in early Egyptian. We find the reduction of short vowels in pre-tonic open syllables to schwa and the subsequent development of biconsonantal onsets. Overall, the inventory of open syllables in later Egyptian into Coptic had become much more varied and open syllables more frequent, primarily due to the loss of final consonantal phonemes. Also, the distinction between the four H sounds of classical Egyptian had faded in the 2nd century AD. Thus, the graphemes that represented sounds that had fallen together were no longer needed and could either be dropped or functionally reinterpreted. That is what we saw when we talked about regional differences. Since Egyptian phonology changed significantly over the centuries, as just mentioned, what was a good fit for earlier Egyptian was no longer such a good fit for later Egyptian. So what happened in the case of the transition from Demotic to Coptic is a change from a mixed writing system in that graphemes could represent phonological units or phonemes to an alphabetic writing system in which graphemes represent phonemes. So basically to a writing system with a smaller grain size. The phonological change in Egyptian the phonological changes in Egyptian seem to have made this change possible, if not even preferable. The increase in the repertoire of open syllables and the elision of short vowels in short open syllables meant that former syllables were often reduced to consonants in many environments. The above-mentioned biconsonantal onsets that developed are really just one environment where a syllable-based writing system would no longer fare too well, but which are unproblematic in an alphabetic writing system. Let me come to a short summary and conclusion and wrap it all up. So, we saw that there's no one-to-one correspondence between a language and a writing system, and thus we have the opportunity of changing writing systems, which is exactly what we saw in the transition from traditional Egyptian writing systems to the Coptic alphabet. We also said that the underlying model of the Coptic alphabet is the Greek alphabet, yet this was modified with regard to the shape and inventory of graphemes, then drawing on demotic, on inherited Egyptian graphemes. The socio-political circumstances of the period in question can account for the Greek alphabet serving as our model. We said it's very available and very prominent. The phonological changes in Egyptian that made viable using a writing system with a grain size smaller than the one of the inherited Egyptian writing systems, that is an evolutionary shift. And the experimentation with the shape and number of additional graphemes in local communities of practice is the creative element involved in the emergence of the Coptic alphabet. Thus basically, evolution and creation complement each other, resulting in the first Egyptian alphabet.
Thank you very much. Any questions? I see bravos and encouragement, but no questions, comments. Yes, Dad Harbour.
You'll notice I always have questions about everything, basically. What was going on with Coptic grammar? Why do you think they didn't just go for a consonantal alphabet with more minimal vowel writing? Had the templatic structure to a large extent been lost? I mean, it's been like 25 years since I've looked at Coptic grammar. I just can't recall much of it now.
So I guess that is just relevant in the sense of that Coptic phonology is a bit different from like earlier Egyptian, because otherwise like how the grammar changes, I mean, they write vowels at that point, but you, in theory, you would have, or you could have used vowels earlier already. Sure, some endings are like vocalic, so it is quite useful to have the vowels. But then on the other hand, the Egyptian script worked before, so there must be kind of some, so I kind of, this is why I didn't kind of pay specific attention to like grammatical changes or like changes beyond phonology, like in the area of syntax or anything, because the system worked before and the language develops like continuously. And then at some point you have this completely systemic change in the writing system, but you don't have a systemic change in the grammar. So the grammar is really kind of one continuum running all the way through into Coptic, whereas in the writing system, or with the writing systems, plural, you have this massive systemic change when it comes like to Coptic then. Yeah, I think it's mostly about the change in the phonological structure, and then kind of the writing system or the Coptic alphabetic system fits quite nicely. Why not come up with a completely different system? To a certain extent, I think if you have an alphabetic writing system that's quite prominent around and you can model on that, why not do it to a certain extent? Like, why would you create a script completely artificially?
Yeah, that wasn't quite what I meant, but
Sorry.
So I was just wondering, was the pressure of the Egyptian system with underrepresentation of vowels at this point so far removed from daily practice that really the only option was to take the Greek system with vowels written and just to continue that tradition? Or was there competition in which people might have been saying, oh, maybe we'll write vowels, maybe we won't, and then it's just a matter of time so you see which one wins out?
To a certain extent, competition, yes, because you have several systems that kind of develop in the in this period, 2nd, 3rd centuries, and they do compete, and in the end, one system does win out. So competition for sure, and it is not just alphabetic systems, but you also kind of move from the demotic alphabet to like a more simplified or an alphabetic demotic version, what they call it. So there's a bit of competition going on, and then kind of the Coptic alphabet wins out in the end. So that for sure, in the sense of kind of vowels or kind of not writing vowels and there being too much pressure on the Egyptian system, I'm not entirely sure about that, because as I say, grammatically there's rather continuity than a sudden break. So then you would have to argue, well, they are mounting pressures and at some point they are so strong that you kind of have to go to an alphabetic system. I'm not sure I could find that in Coptic. So
okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. And another question by Amalia Gnanadesigan.
Hey, this is very interesting, but I've sort of putting together what you're talking about with what I've been thinking about with S1 and S2. And so I'm thinking about literacy rates in Greek versus the Egyptian systems. And so what do we know about literacy rates in the two systems? Because if literacy was higher in Greek, that would mean that Greek was S1 for people. And you would expect then them to have a preference for Greek.
Definitely, obviously I don't have like statistics for that, but I do get the impression just from what we have from like educational context that literacy rates in Greek were higher than in Egyptian. So you're definitely, absolutely, I completely agree that is one factor. That is what I try to capture under like, it was very available or very prominent in the surroundings. Yeah, that's, maybe I should have phrased that more like this, but that is, I completely agree.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria, for this very captivating talk.